In the Binding of Fenrir, the dynamic of trust between Fenrir and Tyr may have been violated, but in the end, Tyr was there to give him a hand. There are a multitude of wolves throughout Norse myth. Odin's wolves, Geri and Freki, haunt the aftermath of battlefields. Skoll and Hati chase after the sun and the moon. But in Norse myth, there is only one wolf that comes to mind when one references the wolf, and that is Fenrir, son of Loki. The place of wolves in Norse myth is complex. They are often framed as malicious, which makes sense in a society that valued livestock. Wolves would often come out of the woods and take from the livestock, thereby taking meals and wealth away from a farmer. So it's no wonder that the wolf is often framed as the enemy of social order. Skoll and Hati, for example, are said to one day capture and destroy the sun and the moon. But there are further wolves placed in a more positive context. Odin's wolves, for example, dwell among the Aesir and serve the Allfather. Odin's association with wolves is strong and further mentioned in the Heimskringla, where Odin's wolf warriors are described as going into battle without armor and acting like wolves. They were powerful warriors, said to be unaffected by fire nor iron. And this image on a Torslunda plate furthers this relationship, as here we likely see Odin with spears in a dance with a wolf warrior. This possible depiction of a berserker ritual is referenced in the Northmen in a ritual dance to unleash the inner beast, led by a man wearing the same helmet that's depicted on this plate. One of these wolf warriors, or Olfafnar, is depicted in Egil's saga as Egil's grandfather, Kveldolf. His prowess in battle is unquestioned in the text, most notably described as he defends his ship in an escape to Iceland with his son. Berserker rage was said to create a state in which no man was a match for them, but that afterwards they would weaken. And the same is said of Kveldolf, who in his old age successfully defends his son, using his axe to brutally tear apart a man pursuing them. But then he dies of illness in the following days at sea. Taking these wolfmen in mind, it's interesting to ask if Fenrir is actually a wolf. Why would a union between Loki and Angrboða create a wolf? Fenrir's mother, Angrboða, is known as the mother of monsters. Her name means one who offers sorrow, and not much is known about her beyond her children, Jörmungandr, Hel, and Fenrir. Hel seems to be more of a traditional goddess, if controversial, and not considered among the Aesir. Jörmungandr is an entity of the deep. As a powerful serpent, he draws comparison across myth with entities that are depicted with humanoid forms, suggesting that there may be more to Jörmungandr than Norse myth allows us to directly see. Jörmungandr's complexity prompts some interesting questions about Fenrir. Is he born a wolf, or did he choose the form of a wolf? And if he chose that form, what does it mean? Does this form cause him to lean in the direction of the protective wolves that we find across myth, or the ones set on stealing our livestock? Fenrir's story gives us an image of a being who is not only incredibly powerful, but very intelligent. In the famous story of his binding, he speaks to and intimidates the gods. He is a force to be negotiated with and placated. So let's talk about the stories around Fenrir. Fenrir starts out as a wolf pup and is among the forces that Odin has brought before him after hearing that the children of Loki would bring calamity to the gods. Hel is given dominion over death and the land of the dead. Jörmungandr is thrown into the sea, and Fenrir is chilling in Asgard, probably because of Odin's association with wolves. He would grow massively each day, and Tyr was the only god with the courage to approach Fenrir and feed him. Tyr, the strong proponent of the sentiment that Fenrir deserves headpats. It is easily assumed here that Fenrir developed a trust towards Tyr. All the gods seemed afraid of him, or at least lacked the courage to approach him, as he is this massive wolf surrounded by foreboding prophecies. And yet Tyr, god of justice and law, finds the courage to simply stroll up to Fenrir and give him food. And as he grew, the Aesir developed a plan to bind Fenrir and prevent him from fulfilling the prophecies around him. They brought forward various bindings, framing the binding of Fenrir as a game for Fenrir to show off his strength. And Fenrir decided to play along, breaking the bindings easily. Eventually, the gods arranged for the construction of a binding through the dwarves that appeared thin and slender, and they showed it to Fenrir. And the wolf rightly noticed that this was a binding that he would prove no strength by breaking, and that if it were supposed to be a challenge, it is constructed with art and trickery. And he told the gods that he was no longer interested in playing their game. But the gods promised him that if he couldn't break out of this, then, well, hey, he would show that he is not a threat, not a terror to the gods, and thus prove that he should be set free. Fenrir's sitting over here like, doubt. But Fenrir stipulated that there needed to be some security, that one of the gods should put their hand in his mouth during the ordeal. And the gods were largely uninterested in this deal until Tyr stepped forward and offered his own hand. Fenrir, trusting of Tyr, accepted the deal, and the fetters were placed on. And Fenrir could not escape, and the gods would not let him go. So Fenrir bit off Tyr's hand at the wolf's joint, a name for the wrist. And Snorri even writes that the gods laughed at the situation, except for Tyr, who lost his hand. The gods then took the bound Fenrir and strung him up from a stone slab. In the process of this, Fenrir stretched out his jaws and snapped at the gods, who responded by bracing his mouth open with a sword. And so there Fenrir struggles, bound and muzzled with a sword in his jaws, until Ragnarok. This brings to mind an interesting dynamic often associated with prophecies. The prophecy around Fenrir seems to be something that is fulfilled by the existence of the prophecy and the attempt to avoid it. And Fenrir's actions at Ragnarok seem justified by revenge on acts taken against him because of the prophecy that he fulfills by taking that revenge. This suggests that, of the gods, Tyr had the right instinct to simply show kindness to Fenrir and give him food. And this is part of why the story of Fenrir at Ragnarok seems so strange. From the story of the Binding of Fenrir, we would gather that the main motivation for revenge that Fenrir has is directed at Tyr. But in the tales of Ragnarok, both from Snorri and the Voluspa, Odin is his target. This is perhaps because the decision to bind Fenrir may have rested with Odin rather than Tyr. But it's plainly obvious in the story that Tyr violated the trust that he had built up with Fenrir. But let's explore this a bit. In the Prose Edda, Tyr is killed, but by Garmr, who Snorri describes as distinct from Fenrir. The name Garmr presents an interesting problem. In the Voluspa, Garmr is referenced as the one who bays loudly at the dawn of Ragnarok, suggesting to some that Garmr is actually Fenrir. He is also sometimes posited as the dog who guards the gates of hell, and may be the blood-covered, unnamed dog barking at Odin in the Poetic Edda as Odin enters the land of the dead. And this makes some, including myself, associate Garmr with the death goddess Hel as her loyal guardian. There are other poetic references of Garmr as the best of hounds, which confounds the theory that Garmr and Fenrir are the same, and which makes Snorri's reference of him killing Tyr all the more confusing. It seems like our little bud, our little hell-pupper. He's getting slandered here. I don't like it. It's possible that Garmr and Fenrir were once considered the same entity, and that's why we have a somewhat offhanded blurb, offhanded, from Snorri, in which Garmr is the killer of Tyr and Fenrir is the killer of Odin. And maybe that's why the cries of Garmr harken Ragnarok. But who is Garmr the Great Hound? Is he the pet of Tyr or Hel? Is he perhaps the name of the young Fenrir? Or is Fenrir someone else entirely? One of Fenrir's names is Fenrisúlfr, the Wolf of Fenrir, a name that's never really been fully explained. And the same goes for, interestingly enough, the name Fenrir, which may mean something along the lines of swamp dweller, but we don't know. Every single video, I swear, it's something like, there's a thing, we have no idea, it's no clue, it's lost to time, everything is screwed, I hate history. I love history, I hate history. If Fenrisúlfr and Fenrir are the same entity, then perhaps Fenrisúlfr refers to the wolf form of Fenrir, implying that he also has some other form. Shapeshifting is not at all strange in Norse myth, and Fenrir is supposed to be the son of Loki, a god known for his shapeshifting. But whatever the case, it seems that every reference we have to Fenrir references his perhaps chosen form, that of a wolf. Maybe it's just his favorite form, or his final form, or maybe he's just stuck like an animorph who stayed in morph for longer than 2 hours. It's in his fire-breathing wolf form that Fenrir exacts his revenge, destroying the sun, killing Sol, and then killing Odin. Fenrir's fate, however, according to Snorri and the Voluspa, comes to a close when revenge is taken on him. the son of Odin, Vithar, god of vengeance, boots Fenrir's jaw to the ground and then rips open his mouth, decapitating him at the jaw. There are two other mentions of Fenrir worth bringing up outside of the Eddas, and both reference a foreboding presence about him. One is the Eiriksmal, an ode to the ruthless King Eric Bloodaxe. Odin is asked why he took Eric before his time, why he chose not to favor such a devoted warrior. And Odin responds that the future is uncertain, and that the wolf is looking grimly at the gods' dwellings. One can take two things from this, in my opinion. One, that Odin wanted Eric Bloodaxe due to that uncertainty, or another, that the mere presence of Eric Bloodaxe in Valhall is a deterrence to the wolf. The other mention that I want to point out is the Hakonarmal, which claims that an unfettered Fenrisúlfr will ravage the realm of men before there is ever seen again a king as good as Hakon. And this suggests that the story of Fenrir unleashing havoc and bringing about some cataclysmic event is something that has long been in the background of Norse myth. It even says unfettered, which inspires an interesting discussion around the binding of Fenrir and whether or not it was always a part of Norse myth. So, it's likely that this story developed over time, but the question that will crop up is, how much of this story contains Christian influence? Ragnarok, as expressed in the Voluspa as well as Snorri's description, seems rife with Christian influence and interpolation. But let me throw a wrench into this with a quote from Revelation, the King James Version, because, it's pretty. "And I saw an angel come down from heaven, having the key of the bottomless pit and a great chain in his hand. And he laid hand on the dragon, that old serpent, which is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years, and cast him down into the bottomless pit, and shut him up, and set a seal upon him, that he should deceive the nations no more, till the 1,000 years should be fulfilled. And after that, he must be loosened a little season." Revelation 20, 1-3. The bound devil, or fettered devil, is a trope that appears from time to time in various stories, and can be seen as evidence of Christian influence. Revelation is dated to the late 1st century CE, and Christianity's influence spread far and wide, and it absolutely made it to Scandinavia by the 10th century in the reign of Hakon the Good. And it should be noted as well that Hakon was himself a Christian. The Hakonarmal suggests a bound Fenrir. The Eiriksmal, however, could be interpreted either way. And Eric Bloodaxe was a pagan, and the king before Hakon the Good. A synthesis of Christianity and heathen beliefs cropped up around the time of Hakon the Good. There were many Christopagans, that is, people who worshipped Christ among the many gods. The Hakonarmal gives the story of Hakon the Good, a Christian, getting accepted into Valhall for his death in battle in light of his kindness to heathens during his rule. It's a very interesting little moment, and perhaps there was a point in transition around this time of the story of Fenrir. Nothing can be said for sure, obviously. The story of the binding of Fenrir is difficult to date, but there are some Christianized elements that seem to be at play. The demonization of the death goddess, Hel, for example, is present at the beginning of the legend, and she, too, is seen as something around which there is malicious prophecy. Odin's solution, however, is to give her mastery over death. It doesn't really seem to make sense. And this prophecy, by the way, is never fulfilled in Hel's case. She is absent at Ragnarok. Elements of this story don't smell right. And perhaps the binding of Fenrir and the casting him as a fettered devil is among these influences. But whatever the case, even if we do accept that the bound Fenrir story is a Christian influence and a revision upon an older legend, often these revisions are based on something that already exists, which means that the Tyr and Fenrir dynamic cannot be dismissed. The betrayal of Fenrir cannot be dismissed. The story may be the same in function, but resulting in a Fenrir that is held at bay and exiled, as was often the punishment in Icelandic law, rather than bound. The central theme in Fenrir's story is very old, and one that keeps getting retold, that sometimes we create our own monsters. Milton's Paradise Lost and Mary Shelley's Frankenstein both play with this idea. But something to remember is that in the case of Lucifer and the creature and even Fenrir, within their own story, from their point of view, they are the hero. So, should heathens engage in praxis with Fenrir? It's a good question, and I think it depends upon interpretation. I think that often we give too much credence to the myth as written, when perhaps we should be looking a little deeper at the themes. As written, Fenrir seems the villain. He's the world ender, a god killer. Why give Praxis to that which is set to end the world? We do have some suggestion of Praxis with Surt, another world ender, but that seems to be a Praxis that is rooted in placation. Should Fenrir be approached in the same way, if at all? And based on the information that we have, it may be reasonable to say that Fenrir fits in this same category. Personally, I prefer an interpretation of Fenrir as unbound. It certainly fills in some blanks when it comes to Hati, the wolf who chases the moon, said to be the son of Fenrir. I also tend to lean towards interpretation of figures framed as malicious as more balanced than they may appear, especially in cases of apparent Christian influence. Perhaps not necessarily as evil, but more as part of things. I want to give a shout out to Wolf the Red, a close friend of mine who has a Praxis with Fenrir. And he has an interesting justification for it that got me thinking a little bit more on Fenrir myself. So here he is.
Thanks, Ocean. My Praxis with Fenrir is very nuanced, and not as black and white as, say, my relationship with Thor or Hel. I'm a dad, a biker, a blue-collar worker, and known for my activism fighting against folkists. I see Fenrir as a force to be reckoned with, a fierce and tenacious agent that uses violence to achieve his goals of revenge against those he perceives to have done him an injustice. We have many examples of violence being a tool of the oppressed, from thousands of years ago to even recently, as people fight for basic human rights with their own teeth and claws. I see Fenrir as the breaker of chains, the one who inspires others to get to their feet and take action against a system that would do anything to keep them down. I actually just finished this piece that really captures the image and attitude I hold of Fenrir. The great wolf who refuses to remain bound and will do what needs to be done to break his chains and get the justice he deserves. I think that's worth veneration. In my offerings, I tend to stick to raw and cooked meat. I also have, on occasion, offered giant dog bones for the biggest of boys. I offered a Fenrir on the edge of the woods to lure the wolf from the wilds closer to the home when I feel that need to strengthen my own resolve and invite that level of ferocity into my life. But it's not an all-the-time thing. Just like violence is only useful in some situations, veneration to Fenrir is rare and done sparingly. The wolf can never fully be tamed. He will always be wild and unpredictable, and due to that, should be given space. But gifts to the wild one can sometimes get gifts of useful chaos in return. Until next time, go big or go home.
Thanks, Wolf. And if you want to check out more from Wolf the Red, you can find links to his channel and our merch in the description below. But as I said earlier, Wolf's perspective got me thinking as I did more research into Fenrir, and I think that my perspective on him has evolved. Our journeys of spiritual exploration allow us to make new discoveries, and I think there's a lot of nuance with Fenrir as far as where you can land with him. But let me tell you where I'm at for now. Fenrir, to me, can be seen as a reflection of Tyr, the god of justice, and to an extent Odin in terms of leadership and stability. Fenrir is that which threatens stability. Law, justice, and good leadership can keep Fenrir at bay, but when law is abused and justice turns to injustice, Fenrir may set fires until justice is restored. And I think it's reasonable to say that most of the time stability is preferable. But if that stability promotes injustice, perhaps Fenrir ought be unleashed. And if leadership cannot return justice, then Fenrir can bring about the end of that leadership and tear everything down. But that's my personal interpretation. You can take it or leave it. Hail to my patrons for making this content possible. It's good to have people at your back. Be sure to like the vid if you enjoyed it, and let me know where y'all are at on this dynamic with Fenrir, if you agree with me or disagree with me. It's an interesting conversation, but I want to leave y'all with this thought. Something that occurs to me is that in the Völuspá, Tyr is never mentioned, and Snorri's mention of Garmr killing Tyr seems shoehorned in. Perhaps, somewhere, there's a missing story of Tyr visiting the bound or exiled Fenrir. And with his sense of justice, giving him a little food. Remember to find a way or make one. I think it's fairly uncontroversial, though, that even Tyr holds that little Bupper Fenrir deserves head pats.